China's new battery doesn't need lithium, and it just hit mass production. Here is the number that stopped analysts cold. One company just shipped batteries built almost entirely from sodium, a material pulled from ordinary salt, at a cost of roughly $30 per kilowatt hour. You heard that right, $30. Less than half the cost of the lithium battery in your phone right now. Picture a battery cheaper than the cardboard box it ships in, relative to what it stores. And that is just the beginning, because cost was never the hardest problem this technology had to solve. If cheap, lithium-free power sounds like the future arriving early. Hit a quick like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how sodium is quietly replacing the most critical material in modern energy. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand why lithium became irreplaceable in the first place. For 70 years, lithium has been the undisputed king of energy storage, and that dominance was never an accident. Engineers love lithium because it is the lightest metal on the periodic table, meaning it packs enormous energy into remarkably little weight. Manufacturers love lithium because 3 decades of factory refinement turned a fragile laboratory chemistry into a product that could be stamped out by the millions with startling reliability. Governments love lithium because it became the backbone of an entire economic transition, from smartphones in your pocket to electric vehicles rolling off assembly lines in Shanghai and Berlin alike. Picture a AA battery, then imagine cramming 10 times its energy into the same space. That is roughly what lithium chemistry achieves compared to the lead-acid batteries it replaced. A single lithium-ion cell can now store around 260 watt-hours per kilogram, enough energy in 1 pound of material to run a refrigerator for close to an hour. That is not a small engineering win. That is a foundation an entire century of devices was built on. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. By the early 2000s, lithium-ion cells were charging faster, lasting longer, and shrinking smaller with almost every product cycle. From cordless drills to laptops to the first mass-market electric cars. Factories in China, South Korea, and Japan spent billions perfecting the manufacturing process, driving costs from over $1,000 per kilowatt hour in the early 2010s to under $100 today, a drop steep enough to make electric vehicles genuinely affordable. Every dollar shaved off that curve was a genuine engineering achievement, not a shortcut. So why didn't anyone solve this sooner and reach for something else entirely? Because nothing else came close on paper. Here is the part most people never stop to consider. Lithium is not just light and energy dense, it is also chemically cooperative, willingly shuttling ions back and forth between electrodes for thousands of charge cycles without falling apart. Sodium, its closest cousin on the periodic table, sat right next to it the entire time, abundant and cheap, yet largely ignored by serious engineers for half a century. The reason was simple. Sodium atoms are nearly 3 times heavier than lithium atoms, and early attempts to use them produced batteries that were bulky, unstable, and quietly disappointing. Respect for lithium was earned, not inherited. It solved real problems at real scale for real decades. Lithium built the modern battery industry. But here is the thing. As impressive as that legacy is, it was always built on a foundation with a hidden weakness, and that weakness was about to become impossible to ignore. The flaw was never in lithium's performance. It was in where lithium actually comes from. Roughly 70% of the world's lithium reserves sit in just 4 countries: Australia, Chile, Argentina, and China. And the refining step, the part that turns raw ore into battery-grade material, is even more concentrated, with China alone processing close to 60% of the world's supply. This is not about a single company facing a bad quarter. It is about an entire global industry depending on a handful of mines and refineries that any drought, export restriction, or price spike could throttle overnight. Here is what most people get wrong about this problem. They assume the issue is running out of lithium entirely. It is not. The world has enough lithium reserves at current estimates to last centuries at present demand. The real vulnerability is price volatility and supply concentration. In 2022 alone, lithium carbonate prices spiked from roughly $7,000 a ton to over $80,000 a ton in under 12 months, a swing large enough to erase profit margins across an entire industry in a single fiscal year. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between a profitable electric vehicle and one sold at a loss. Picture a restaurant where the price of flour triples overnight, then triples again by winter. That is the kind of whiplash battery manufacturers were absorbing on their single most important ingredient. The consequence rippled everywhere. Automakers delayed vehicle launches. Battery manufacturers signed increasingly desperate long-term contracts just to lock in supply. Smaller countries trying to build their own battery industries found themselves priced out entirely, dependent on whoever controlled the mines. Entire national energy strategies were being written around a material most of those governments could not produce a single ounce of within their own borders. Extraction itself carries its own cost. Producing 1 ton of lithium from brine deposits in Chile's Atacama Desert can consume close to 500,000 gallons of water, an amount that would fill roughly 3/4 of an Olympic swimming pool, drawn from one of the driest places on Earth. Researchers across China had been quietly asking a different question for years. What if the industry's dependence on lithium wasn't actually necessary at all? In 2018, a small group of scientists began answering that question with data that was harder to dismiss than anything the field had seen before. That data was about to turn a decades-old joke of a battery chemistry into the most closely watched material in energy storage. The breakthrough traces back to CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, working alongside researchers at the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. By 2023, that collaboration had a working sodium-ion cell ready for commercial announcement, and by 2025, factories in Fuyang and Xiamen were producing them at industrial scale. The core idea sounds almost too simple once you hear it. Replace the lithium ions moving inside a battery with sodium ions, an element sitting 1 row below lithium on the periodic table, roughly 400 times more abundant in the Earth's crust. Earlier attempts dating back to the 1970s and 80s tried exactly this and failed for a specific, well-understood reason. Sodium atoms are significantly larger than lithium atoms, and when you force a bigger atom through the same tightly packed graphite structure that works beautifully for lithium, the structure cracks and degrades within a few hundred charge cycles. Imagine trying to park a full-size truck in a space designed for a compact car. It technically fits once, but the curb gets destroyed in the process. That was sodium's problem for 50 years. Here is the part that changed everything. Instead of forcing sodium into graphite, researchers redesigned the parking space itself. They developed a new anode material called hard carbon, structured with wider, more disordered internal gaps, specifically shaped to accommodate sodium's larger size without cracking under repeated use. On the cathode side, engineers layered in Prussian white, an iron-based compound that shuttles sodium ions efficiently while avoiding cobalt and nickel entirely, 2 metals that carry their own separate supply chain headaches. Now, here is what makes this incredibly exciting. This was not a workaround or a compromise. It was a structural rethink of how the battery holds its charge-carrying ions altogether, built for sodium's actual properties instead of forcing it to imitate lithium. The cycle, life numbers finally became credible. Lab testing confirmed cells surviving beyond 3,000 full charge cycles, a bar that finally cleared the threshold for real vehicle use. There was a second, quieter advantage buried inside the redesign. Sodium-ion cells could use aluminum current collectors on both electrodes instead of the copper required by lithium. Since sodium does not corrode aluminum the way lithium does at low voltage, copper costs roughly 4 times more than aluminum by weight, so that single substitution stripped meaningful cost out of every cell before it reached the production line. None of this was luck. It was 5 years spent solving a material problem the rest of the world had quietly written off. The chemistry finally worked on paper. The only question left was whether it could survive contact with the real world. Here is the honest number first. Sodium-ion cells currently store around 160 watt-hours per kilogram, compared to roughly 260 for a top-tier lithium-ion cell. That is a real gap, close to 40% less energy packed into the same weight of material. But here is what that number actually means in practice. For a compact city car with a battery pack designed for around 200 miles of range, that energy gap translates into roughly 30 fewer miles per charge, a difference most daily commuters would barely notice inside a single week of ordinary driving, especially with a charging network already built around frequent short top-ups rather than long road trips. The unexpected advantage shows up somewhere lithium has always struggled: cold weather. Sodium-ion cells retain roughly 90% of their capacity at negative 20 degrees Celsius, a temperature that can drop a comparable lithium cell down to 60 or 70% capacity. Picture a lithium battery on a frozen morning in Harbin, behaving like a runner who skipped breakfast, sluggish and underpowered, while the sodium cell barely notices the cold at all. That single property alone opens markets that lithium has always handled poorly. Countries across northern China, Scandinavia, and Canada have spent years watching electric vehicle adoption stall in winter months, precisely because of this weakness. And sodium's cold weather resilience directly targets that stalled market, rather than competing head-on in the warm climate segment lithium already dominates. There is also a non-obvious application where sodium already wins outright today: stationary grid storage. Utility-scale battery farms do not care about squeezing out every last watt-hour per kilogram, since the batteries sit still in a warehouse rather than riding inside a vehicle. What they do care about is cost, safety, and cycle life. 3 categories where sodium's chemistry, built around iron and manganese instead of scarce cobalt and nickel, already outperforms lithium on a dollar per cycle basis. Grid operators in provinces like Guangdong have already begun swapping planned lithium installations for sodium alternatives, simply because the economics no longer make sense any other way. Now, here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. Sodium-ion cells also demonstrate meaningfully better thermal stability, resisting the kind of runaway overheating that has caused high-profile lithium battery fires in electric vehicles and grid installations alike. The question was no longer whether sodium worked. The question was how fast the world could deploy it. That question was about to get answered in a factory, not a laboratory. In Fuyang Anhui Province, CATL brought its first dedicated sodium-ion production line online in December of 2025, with an annual capacity of 30 gigawatt-hours, enough to supply battery packs for roughly 600,000 compact electric vehicles in a single year. Early field data from low-speed electric vehicles and two-wheelers already deployed across cities like Hefei showed cycle life and cold weather performance matching laboratory projections within a margin of just a few percentage points. The field matched the forecast. Over 18 months of monitored operation, the tested fleet retained close to 92% of original capacity, a figure that fell squarely within the range CATL had projected before a single unit left the factory. That distinction matters more in this industry than almost any other, because battery chemistries have a long history of dazzling in a lab and disappointing on the road, where vibration, humidity, and years of real charging habits punish weaknesses that a controlled test bench never reveals. A battery engineer at a major Chinese manufacturer put it plainly in an industry briefing. "We have seen too many promising chemistries die in the gap between the lab and the road. This one did not." The manufacturing compatibility detail matters just as much as the chemistry itself. Sodium-ion cells can be produced on roughly 90% of the same equipment already used for lithium-ion manufacturing, meaning factories did not need to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. That single fact lowered the barrier to adoption dramatically, letting existing battery giants retool existing lines in months rather than building entirely new facilities over years. A difference in timeline measured in billions of dollars saved on capital expenditure alone. Publicly archived field performance data, published through China's National Battery Testing Consortium, now lets independent researchers verify these cycle life and safety claims rather than relying on manufacturer press releases alone. If a battery this cheap performing this well in real winter conditions surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you're there when we cover it. It started with one application where cost mattered more than energy density: low-speed vehicles and grid storage. Then it spread outward from there, into scooters, delivery fleets, backup power systems, and now full-size passenger cars entering showrooms this year. The claim now had receipts. That kind of validation does not stay contained within one country's borders for very long. More than 1,200 international patent families now cite sodium-ion battery chemistry, filed across China, the United States, South Korea, and the European Union. These are legal and financial commitments, each one representing months of engineering hours and legal review that a company would not spend on a chemistry it did not intend to build around. CATL announced in early 2026 that it would integrate sodium-ion cells into a dedicated line of budget electric vehicles under its Naxtra brand, targeting a starting price under $10,000. BYD confirmed a $2 billion investment into its own sodium-ion production facility in Guizhou province, aiming for commercial vehicle integration by 2027. South Korea's Samsung SDI opened a sodium-ion research division in Suwon in 2025, publicly citing China's cost advantage as the driving motivation. Even European firm Northvolt, despite its well-documented financial struggles, redirected a portion of its remaining research budget towards sodium chemistry rather than abandoning the space entirely. Meanwhile, India's Reliance Industries announced a pilot sodium-ion facility outside Jamnagar in late 2025, framing the move explicitly as a way to sidestep dependence on imported lithium altogether. Regulatory pressure in China has accelerated all of this. Beijing's 2025 industrial policy explicitly named sodium-ion battery development as a strategic priority, offering tax incentives to manufacturers who hit domestic production milestones ahead of schedule, alongside preferential financing for provinces that added sodium-ion capacity to their 5-year infrastructure plans. Here is what most people get wrong about how this competition actually works. It is rarely driven by ideology or national pride. It is driven by spreadsheets. In any market where a battery chemistry offers a 30 to 40% cost advantage at comparable performance, that advantage is not a trend. It is a competitive pressure no serious company can afford to ignore. China's National Battery Testing Consortium now publishes quarterly cycle life and safety data from sodium-ion production lines through an open access portal, letting competitors, regulators, and independent researchers verify performance claims without relying solely on company press releases. That kind of transparency is itself a competitive weapon, forcing every rival to either match the openness or explain the silence. Analysts tracking the sector note that transparency of this kind has historically shortened the gap between announcement and genuine investor confidence by a matter of years, not months. The corporate scramble was no longer confined to China's borders. It had become a global race with a starting gun already fired. Industry analysts project sodium-ion batteries could capture roughly 10 to 15% of the global battery market by 2030, a slice that, at current market size, translates to storage capacity equivalent to powering every household in Germany for a full year. Beyond cost, the secondary benefit is supply chain diversification. Because sodium can be extracted from seawater and common mineral deposits found on every inhabited continent, countries with no lithium reserves at all, from Indonesia to Morocco, could realistically build domestic battery industries for the first time. That shift alone could redraw a global supply map that has favored a small handful of lithium-rich nations for over a generation. But turning a promising technology into a global standard is a long road, and it is important to be honest about where that road gets genuinely difficult. The obstacles are specific. Energy density still trails lithium by roughly 40%, meaning sodium will likely remain a poor fit for long-range vehicles and aviation for the foreseeable future. Production scale remains tiny compared to lithium's decades-long head start. 30 gigawatt-hours sounds impressive until you compare it to the nearly 700 gigawatt-hours of lithium-ion capacity, China alone, produced in 2025. Supply chains for hard carbon anode material are still immature, with only a handful of qualified suppliers capable of meeting automotive-grade purity standards. Western markets face their own separate hurdle. Import tariffs and trade restrictions on Chinese battery technology could slow adoption outside China by years, regardless of the underlying economics. Consumer trust is a real, if less technical, obstacle too. An entire generation of buyers associates battery quality with lithium branding, and shifting that perception will take years of deliberate, sustained marketing, rather than a single successful product launch. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. Even optimistic industry roadmaps do not project sodium-ion reaching cost and manufacturing parity with lithium's current infrastructure before the early 2030s. None of these challenges change what the science shows is possible. They define the gap between what is technically achievable and what will actually happen at scale. Closing that gap is an investment problem, a policy problem, and a coordination problem as much as a chemistry one. The researchers who published this work gave the world a tool. Whether the world picks it up at the speed the transition demands is a different question entirely. That question was about to widen far beyond batteries alone. The story of sodium-ion batteries is ultimately the story of what human civilization can build and where it can build it. For most of the battery age, energy storage has been geographically gated, available first and cheapest to whichever nations happen to sit on top of lithium deposits. That gate is starting to swing open. Consider who stands to gain the most from this shift. Countries across Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, regions with enormous solar and wind potential, but historically limited access to affordable grid-scale storage, are precisely where sodium's abundance and cost advantage matter most. Nations like Indonesia and Nigeria, sitting on almost no lithium reserves of their own, could leapfrog directly into domestic battery manufacturing, using materials already beneath their feet. That access gap has not closed yet, but for the first time, it has a realistic path toward closing. What is genuinely new here, not incrementally better, but categorically different, is a battery chemistry decoupled from a geographically concentrated, geopolitically fragile supply chain for the first time in the history of modern energy storage. That is not a minor improvement. It is a different category of solution. The researchers who published this work gave the world a tool. Whether the world picks it up at the speed the energy transition demands is a separate question, one that belongs to policymakers, investors, and manufacturers as much as it belongs to scientists. That is new. Batteries are deceptively easy to overlook, sitting quietly inside devices most people never open or inspect. But scale changes everything about how a technology like this compounds over time. A 10% cost reduction across a market measured in the trillions of dollars does not stay a small number for long. It becomes the difference between an energy transition that stalls in the next decade and one that accelerates past every current projection. If a cheaper, more abundant alternative to lithium raises an obvious next question. What does this actually mean for the electric vehicles already filling roads worldwide? That story is worth understanding too, and it is the subject of our next video. China's new sodium battery will change EVs forever. The link is in the description. If this changed how you think about what a battery actually needs to contain, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Turn on notifications. We publish every week. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think sodium-ion batteries will genuinely replace lithium at scale? Or is this a stopgap technology that gets overtaken the moment the next chemistry arrives?